The signs went up first, propped against the porch rail, because I'd spent the better part of 2 days getting the lettering right, and I wasn't about to let paint that hadn't fully cured smear in the yard. Then came the hard part. I went up to the master bedroom, stripped the bed down to the mattress, and half-carried, half-dragged that mattress down the stairs, through the front hall, out the door, and across the lawn to the strip of grass beside the street, where anyone driving by on Larkspur Court would have a clean view of it. I went back for the slats and the bedding, and threw them down the stairs ahead of me the same way, then made a third trip for the frame rails, which came apart easier than I expected once I found the Allen key in the nightstand drawer where it had always lived. I checked my watch on that third trip. 4:22. I had told myself I'd be done by 5, and 5 was not a number I had any flexibility on. Putting the frame back together in the yard so it would read as a bed and not a pile of lumber took until 4:35. After that, the kitchen table was easy, light enough that I walked it out the door sideways by myself and set it next to the bed, like a matched set at a furniture showroom. The last piece was the runner rug from the living room, the 6x9 one we'd bought at a mill outlet in Lawrence the same weekend we closed on the house. I rolled it, carried it out, unrolled it in front of the bed, planted the signs, and looked at my watch again. 4:55. 10 minutes until my wife's car came around the corner of Larkspur, the way it did every single weekday at 5 o'clock. Like a tide you could set a clock by, because for 11 years she had. I walked out to the middle of the street to get the full effect, the way you'd step back from a painting. It was, I'll say this honestly, one of the more satisfying things I have ever looked at. Our marriage bed, our kitchen table, the rug in front of our fireplace. 3 pieces of furniture I now knew, with a certainty that it cost me 11 days and about $4,000 of surveillance equipment to earn, had been used by my wife and her lover on a regular schedule for the better part of 6 months. I walked from sign to sign and read each one out loud to nobody, because I'd written them and I wanted to hear how they sounded in a normal speaking voice, instead of the voice in my head that had been writing and rewriting them for a week. The big one on the porch rail said, "These items are free. Take them. We no longer want them in this house. If you can stomach the smell of infidelity, help yourself." The one over the bed explained in plain sentences that my wife had been meeting her lover in this bed roughly twice a week for 6 months while our children were at school. The one behind the kitchen table explained that they'd use that table too, usually a few hours before she served me dinner on it. The one on the rug just noted dryly that this appeared to be their preferred spot to finish. Each sign had a photograph clipped to it, a still I'd pulled off the security footage and printed at 17 by 24 inches at a print shop in Overland Park that did not ask a single question. The 2 of them caught mid-act, faces clear, nothing left to the imagination about what was happening or who was in it. And behind the table, a 5th sign, smaller, gave his name. Roger Kessling, broker-owner of Prairie Crest Realty, my wife's boss, married, 3 kids, and about to find out that his wife didn't know a thing about any of this. It was 4:57. I turned to take in the crowd that had already started forming, neighbors coming out onto porches. 2 cars stopped dead in the street with their drivers just staring. Somebody with a phone up filming. Somebody else with a phone up making a call that was probably to the police and possibly to a friend on speaker. I gave the street a small, unbothered nod, like a man who just finished mowing, and went back inside and shut the door. At 5 o'clock on the dot, Erin's Subaru came around the corner of Larkspur Court the way it always did. She slowed when she saw the crowd, then slowed more when she started to make out shapes on the lawn. And I watched through the front window as her face went through the whole process in real time. Confusion, then recognition. Then the particular kind of horror that doesn't have a sound attached to it until it does. Even through her closed car window, even over a crowd I'd guess at 40 or 50 people by then, I heard her. "No, oh God, no." Her eyes came off the lawn and found the front window, found me standing in it, and for one long second, we just looked at each other. She was gray. Tears were already down her face. She looked at me like she was asking me a question. And the honest answer was that I'd been asking myself the same question for 11 days and hadn't landed on one yet. I let her have the look for a few more seconds, and then I turned and pulled the curtain shut. Maybe now's the point where I back up and tell you how Erin and I got to that lawn in the first place. because none of it starts there. My name is Marcus Ellery, and I met Aaron Castellano during our junior year at the University of Kansas, set up by a mutual friend who thought we'd hate each other and turned out to be spectacularly wrong. She wasn't the kind of pretty that stopped a room, but she had a laugh that made you want to be the reason for it. 5'4" with dark hair she wore long back then, and a way of tilting her head when she was deciding whether to trust you. I decided within about 3 weeks that I was going to marry her, and I never once seriously doubted I would. We dated hard and fast the way you do at 20, and within a month, we were basically living out of each other's dorm rooms. I won't pretend either of us was inexperienced, but what we had together felt like something neither of us had actually had before. We got married 2 years after graduation and moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lenexa, the kind with a pool nobody used and a parking spot you had to fight for. Erin got her real estate license that first year and started building a client list, one open house at a time. I'd landed an engineering job at Halbrook Medical Systems out in Overland Park, in their medical device division, designing infusion pump electronics, which is about as unglamorous a specialty as engineering offers, but paid the mortgage and then some. For 13 years, we built something I would have sworn under oath was a good marriage. First the apartment, then, once Erin's commissions started outpacing my salary, the house on Larkspur Court, with the basalt-look stone around the fireplace she'd fallen in love with at the model home. We had Maddie, who was 9 that year, and Cole, who was 6, and I thought, genuinely, stupidly thought, that we had it figured out. I wish I could tell you I saw something coming. I didn't. I was living inside a life I trusted completely, and it took our daughter getting sick at school to crack it open. It was a Thursday. I was in a staff meeting a little before noon when my cell buzzed with a call from Maddie's school, and I stepped out into the hallway to take it. The school nurse told me Maddie had a fever and had thrown up in the nurse's office and needed to be picked up, and she said she'd already tried Erin's cell and Erin's office line twice each with no answer. I told her I'd come. I apologized to my team, grabbed my keys, and drove to Maddie's elementary school with that low hum of dad guilt you get whenever your kid is sick, and you're 20 minutes away instead of 5. I picked her up, got her buckled in, and drove home instead of straight to urgent care because she said she just wanted to lie down. When I pulled into our driveway and hit the garage door opener, there was a car in my spot. Not Erin's, mine, the spot on the left, the one I'd parked in every day for 6 years. A silver Audi I didn't recognize. Backed in, tight against the wall like whoever parked it wanted it out of sight from the street. My stomach did something ugly and fast, and I told myself, out loud almost, that it couldn't be what it looked like. That there were 100 boring explanations. An inspector, a contractor Erin had hired without telling me, a friend's car she was storing. I told Maddie to sit tight for a second, that the exterminator was in the house treating for bugs, and the spray might make her feel worse, which was a flat lie. The first one I'd ever told her, and she was too sick and too tired to argue much. Though she did ask twice why we couldn't just go in. I told her to trust me and I'd come back for. I didn't go all the way in. I got close enough to hear that the house wasn't empty, and that was enough. I backed out, drove Maddie to my mother's place across town, told my mom only that I needed her to watch Maddie for a couple hours, and drove back toward the office, feeling like the top half of my skull had come loose. I could have gone home and kicked that door in. Believe me, I ran that version in my head about 6 different ways on the drive. But somewhere around the Metcalf overpass, I decided a confrontation wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was proof, and then I wanted the kind of ending where they never saw it coming until it had already landed. Halbrook Medical shares a building complex with Halbrook's commercial security division. Cameras, access control, the works. Different building, same parking lot. I called my friend Pete Sorensen over there, a guy I'd known since we were both new hires 15 years back, and told my secretary to send him straight in when he showed up. He knocked 20 minutes later, said he was already headed my way to drop off some blueprints for copying. Funny how that works out. And I told him to shut the door. He took one look at me and said, "You look like you saw a ghost." And I told him I had, in a manner of speaking, that I'd come home to pick up our sick daughter and found my wife's boss's car parked in my garage spot with the door shut. He didn't believe me at first, the way you wouldn't, and then he did, because I wasn't the kind of guy who joked about that. I told him I hadn't confronted them, that I'd taken Maddie to my mother's instead, and that what I needed now was evidence, audio, video, something that would hold up and couldn't be talked away in a kitchen argument at 11 at night. Pete asked if I was sure there'd even be a next time. Maybe it was a one-off, he said. Maybe I was about to blow up my whole life over one bad afternoon. I told him no, that pieces had already started rearranging themselves in my memory. Comments Aaron had made about having to run home for a showing. Conversations that made more sense now than they had at the time. And that 6 months of it wasn't hard to believe once I stopped protecting myself from believing it. Our house sat empty most weekdays. It was the obvious place. We spent another 20 minutes working out logistics. Pete had access to a new line of wireless cameras and mics his division was beta testing. Small enough to sit on a bookshelf and never get noticed. All of it able to feed into software on my home office laptop. He also had a little voice-activated recorder, the kind reps use for dictation, that I could tuck under the driver's seat of Erin's car. It'd only catch her side of any call she took while driving, but her side would be plenty. I told him I'd swing by his office the next morning to collect everything, and then I drove home to have dinner with my wife like nothing in the world had happened, which turned out to be the hardest 4 hours of acting I have ever done. I picked Maddie up from my mother's, and when Erin saw her with me, she went pale and started asking a dozen questions at once. I asked flat where she'd been and why the school hadn't been able to reach her. She said she must have had her phone off while showing a house, that she'd been slammed all day. I let it sit there without arguing, thinking privately that she'd probably been a lot more preoccupied with Roger Kessling than with our daughter. But she hugged Maddie and apologized and got her settled with soup and a thermometer. And I noted with something close to bitterness that whatever else was true, she did love our kids. I was apparently just in the way of the rest of it. That night I told Erin I felt off and thought I'd sleep in the guest room in case I was coming down with something, which had the benefit of being half true. She put a hand on my forehead, said I felt clammy, and I went upstairs to grab a toothbrush and clothes for the next day, dreading walking back into our bedroom. The window was cracked open. The sheets had been changed. The room didn't smell like anything but laundry soap, which told me she'd been thorough, and thoroughness told me she'd done this kind of cleanup before. I stood there for a second doing math I didn't want to do. Her boss, whispering God knows what to her in our bed, while our kids were at school 2 miles away. And then I made myself stop, gathered my things, and left. I had a plan to build, and I couldn't afford to fall apart before I'd built it. I barely slept in that guest room. Around midnight, Erin came in thinking I was asleep and stood over the bed for a second, pressed her palm against my forehead again, and left. I left the house early the next morning before she was up, which she'd probably find odd given she was normally the one who took the kids to school, but I didn't especially care what she found odd anymore. At the office before the rest of the staff arrived, I made coffee and made a list. Cancel our joint credit cards and open new ones in my name only. Move half of our joint checking and savings into an account she didn't know existed. Change the beneficiaries on my life insurance and my 401k from Erin to Maddie and Cole. Find a divorce attorney who knew how to protect a father in a no-fault state, because Kansas doesn't care much who cheated when it comes to splitting assets. But it can matter for custody if you show up prepared and she shows up blindsided. It felt strange how mechanical all of it was, dismantling 13 years with a checklist, and some part of me kept waiting to feel the floor buckle. It didn't. Not yet. I figured that reckoning was still coming, and would probably flatten me when it did. I called Pete's office, and he said everything would be ready by lunch and he'd help me install it himself. Around 11, my cell lit up with Erin's name. She asked if I was feeling better, said she felt bad she hadn't been able to check on me before I left. I told her I'd needed to clear my head, which wasn't a lie either. She said she had an idea for how to make it up to me that evening, and I felt something curdle in my chest at the implication, but I kept my voice even and said, we'd see. She noted I sounded distant. I told her I was preoccupied, not uninterested, and we agreed to regroup at home around 6. She reminded me she'd be in the office all day if I needed her, which under the circumstances was almost funny. Pete met me at the loading dock that afternoon, and we loaded a van with everything. Cameras, mics, the recorder, cabling, and had it all installed and tested by 3:30. We ran the software on my home office computer, set up a locked folder to catch everything, and placed units in the living room, the kitchen, the guest room, and the master, where we put 4 cameras to make sure nothing in that room happened outside a lens. We put one in the master bath too, in case they decided a shower together was part of the routine. Everything was motion triggered, so it would only start recording when there was something worth recording. That night was rough in a different way. After the kids were down, I followed Erin up to bed and turned my back to her and pretended to be asleep. She asked if everything was all right, said I'd been different the past 2 days. I told her some half-true thing about feeling insecure, and she reassured me at length that I was more than enough for her, that she couldn't stand the thought of anything happening to me, that I was, and I remember this word specifically because of what I already knew, her perfect partner. I stayed cold, said nothing was wrong, and eventually pretended to drift off. Later I heard her crying quietly next to me, and I felt exactly nothing, though I did wonder, in an academic sort of way, whether it was shame or self-pity driving it. I got up before her the next morning and slid the little recorder under the driver's seat of her Subaru. I also reviewed the footage from the night before to make sure the system had actually caught everything. And it had, even in low light. Erin was a little curt with me at breakfast, said I'd been unkind the night before, then kissed my cheek and brightened up fast enough that I figured she had an afternoon to look forward to. I poured her coffee, told her I'd be buried in my office all day. She mentioned she had houses to show that afternoon and thought she had a big sale close, but promised she'd get the kids after school. I kissed her cheek on my way to the garage, and she called after me that I'd forgotten to say I loved her, that it mattered to her to hear it every morning. I apologized, told her my head was elsewhere, promised I wouldn't forget again. I will say this for the record. I'll tell some woman I love her again someday, when I find one I trust enough to mean it. That day wasn't close. Her mention of afternoon showings told me exactly where she'd likely be, and honestly, I hoped I was right. I wanted this finished. Around noon, I told my secretary I'd be out for a few hours, borrowed a company van so my own truck wouldn't be sitting on our street, and parked across from the house to watch. Erin's car pulled in a little before 1. She left the garage door up when she went inside, which told me she was either heading out again or expecting company. 10 minutes later, I had my answer. The same silver Audi from 2 days earlier turned into the driveway. Roger Kessling took my spot in my garage the way he'd apparently been taking my place in my wife's life, and the door rolled shut behind him. Give them credit for nerve, at least, meeting in my house, in my bed, in broad daylight, either confident they'd never get caught or not caring if they did. I sat there and let myself cry for a minute, which surprised me, because I've been so locked into planning mode, I hadn't expected any of it left in me. 13 years I'd believed my wife would never do this, the same as I'd never have done it to her. Underneath the anger, there was a genuinely dumb, wounded question rattling around. Was he better looking? Better in bed? Better at something I wasn't? And I let myself sit with it, for exactly as long as it took me to realize the question didn't matter, and never would. Roger's car backed out a little before 2:30. Erin followed about 10 minutes later, reapplying lipstick in the rear view as she pulled away, which struck me as almost impressively casual. Once they were both gone, I pulled into my own garage and went straight to the office to confirm the footage was safely on the hard drive. I didn't sit through all of it. 10 minutes was plenty. They'd started on the kitchen table, joking, according to what I heard, about how many meals I'd eaten at that same table without knowing what it had been used for that afternoon. Roger had suggested they use Maddie's room for a change of pace, and Erin had shut that down flat. Said the kids' rooms were off limits, no exceptions, which was, I suppose, the one piece of decency left in the whole arrangement. They'd moved to our bedroom after that, and later to the rug in front of the fireplace. I noticed neither of them said a word about love, though Erin told him more than once he was the best she'd ever had, which was the kind of detail that stopped stinging faster than I expected. I shut the system down, left the mess on the bed for her to deal with when she got back, and drove to work with something that was almost a smile on my face, thinking about what was coming for both of them. I briefed Pete on everything that evening. He couldn't square it either. A woman he'd met a dozen times at company barbecues, seemingly devoted, doing this and going out of her way to make her lover feel bigger by making me smaller in the retelling. He gave me the name of the law firm Halbrook used for corporate work, and their referral got me in front of a divorce attorney named Walt Brennan the next afternoon. He was blunt. Kansas is a no-fault state, and infidelity, however well documented, wasn't going to swing the financial split much, though it could help on custody if I came in organized and she came in scrambling. I told him how I wanted the petition worded and that I also wanted papers drafted against Roger Kessling and Prairie Crest Realty for what his conduct had done to my marriage. He wasn't thrilled about my confidence that I could get Aaron to agree to nearly everything I wanted, but he did what I asked and promised both sets of papers would be ready to serve Friday morning. That evening at home, I kept things flat and civil with Aaron. After a quiet dinner, I went to my study and printed the stills I'd chosen from the footage, wrote the copy for the signs, and put together a letter to Roger's wife, Paige, with prints of the photographs enclosed, along with a note letting her know there was plenty of video if she ever needed it for her own divorce filing. Just after 11, I checked that Aaron was asleep, went out to her car, pulled the recorder from under the seat, and rewound it. What I got was one side of a phone call with Roger, her thanking him for the afternoon, saying she missed him already, floating the idea of a whole week away together disguised as a real estate conference. She mentioned having to keep Marcus happy enough to keep things calm at home, and said what she really wanted was to be with Roger exclusively. They confirmed a Thursday afternoon plan and hung up. I noticed, almost with relief, that none of it landed the way it would have a week earlier. Maybe there was still something left in me that wasn't hers to wound. I swapped in a fresh tape, tucked the recorder back under the seat, and went to bed hardly sleeping at all. Not from heartbreak this time, but from waiting. The next morning I got up while Aaron was still out, and I stood in the doorway a minute looking at her. The woman I'd married, the mother of my kids, the person I'd once assumed I'd grow old next to, and felt something wet gather in my eyes before I turned it off and walked away. I showered, grabbed breakfast at a diner, stopped by the office to tell my secretary I'd be out, and called Pete to tell him today was the day. He wished me luck and told me to be careful. I swung by Walt Brennan's office to confirm both sets of papers were ready to serve, then called Aaron to arrange picking up the kids. My mother wanted them for the long weekend since school was out Friday. Aaron agreed happily, even floated something about us spending Saturday morning in bed together in a tone I recognized and no longer had any use for. I agreed to nothing and got off the phone. By 12:30, I was parked down the block with a clear sightline on our driveway, mostly hidden behind a neighbor's landscaping. I didn't need to see the garage door move. I already knew the schedule. Aaron's car turned in at 10 to 1, Roger's 5 minutes behind her. It should have gutted me, sitting there, knowing what was happening in my own house while I waited around the corner. Instead, I felt oddly steady, almost detached, the way you'd watch a bad movie you already knew the ending of. Roger backed out around 10 to 3. Aaron followed 10 minutes after that, lipstick fresh again. Once the street was clear, I let myself into the house, went straight to the office, and confirmed the last of the footage, including a few more comments about his supposed superiority over me that, this time, genuinely didn't land at all. I spent the next 10 minutes carrying the signs up and staging them by the front door, then packed the bag for the kids, toothbrushes, a few changes of clothes. The only piece of guilt I carried into that afternoon was for what this was about to do to Maddie and Cole. But I reminded myself I hadn't started this. Their mother had, 6 months earlier, and kept choosing it every week since. At 3:15, I was waiting outside their school when the bell rang. I told them they'd get a bonus weekend at Grandma's, which thrilled them both, because my mother's idea of a weekend is unlimited screen time and pancakes for dinner. I dropped them 45 minutes later and drove home to put the rest of the plan into motion. Which brings us back around to where I started. The bed and the table and the rug on the lawn. The signs, the crowd, Erin's car rounding the corner at 5 o'clock sharp, and her face in the window before I let the curtain fall. I expected to hear from her that night. I didn't, not really. There was one late call from her cell where I picked up and got nothing but silence on the other end. About an hour after she'd left, 2 police officers showed up at my door. They were sympathetic enough, but told me I needed to take the signs and photos down before someone filed a public indecency complaint, or the whole thing turned into a bigger legal headache than I wanted. I didn't argue. They'd already done their job. Erin had seen every word of it, and I'd watched her face crack open in front of half the neighborhood before I turned away. That night I put away most of a bottle of Maker's Mark and didn't remember falling asleep. Friday morning arrived with a hangover that deserved its own zip code, but underneath it I felt something close to steady. By noon, looking out the front window, I saw that the rug, the table, and the bed frame had all been taken. By neighbors, I assume, or by whoever decided free furniture beat a guilty conscience, leaving just the mattress and the stained sheets, which I hauled to the dump myself later that day. The morning stayed quiet. By 3 that afternoon, it wasn't. My attorney called to confirm both Aaron and Roger had been served at their respective workplaces, and that Paige Kessling had gotten the letter and photographs that morning as well. He walked me through what he'd heard. Aaron had broken down crying the moment the process server found her at her desk, while Roger reportedly brushed her off entirely and spent his energy threatening legal action against me instead. His partners at Prairie Crest pulled him into a closed-door meeting for 15 minutes and came out having cut him loose. Turned out their partnership bylaws had a morality clause about fraternizing with staff, and they used it. When he refused to sell out his stake quietly, they reminded him he didn't have a choice. Meanwhile, the front desk had Paige on the line, refusing to hang up until someone put Roger on the phone, telling him not to bother coming home and that she'd be filing for divorce the next morning. I heard secondhand from the husband of someone who worked in that office that once Roger was escorted out of the building, not one coworker would look Aaron's way. She sat on the floor of the office for the better part of half an hour, crying before she pulled herself together enough to leave. Nobody there seemed to know where she went after that. She called me the next day, her voice wrecked. She wanted to know if the kids were okay and whether they knew anything. I told her they were safe with my mother and wouldn't hear a single detail from me. She thanked me for that and asked if she could come by to get some things, which I allowed, offering to clear out for a few hours so she wouldn't have to see me. She asked to stay and talk instead. I said no. That brought more tears, and she pushed harder, said she was sorry, that she'd never meant for any of this to hurt me. I actually laughed at that, not kindly, and asked how exactly she thought innocent applied to a woman who'd spent 6 months telling another man he was better than her husband in every way that mattered. I told her I had it recorded, her own voice, and there wasn't a version of this conversation where she talked her way out of what I already had. She insisted she'd always loved only me, that she didn't even understand why she'd said those things to Roger, that she'd said them to build up his ego because he complained constantly about his own marriage. I asked how that explained 6 months of it. She said finally that being with Roger felt dirty, and that she'd wanted to keep that dirtiness separate from what she had with me, which she called clean. Like the two things could just live in different rooms of her life without touching. I told her that made her sound sick, and admitted I felt like a fool for not catching it sooner. She begged for a chance to fix things, swore she belonged to me, asked me not to leave her, which was rich, considering she was the one who'd left first. She just hadn't bothered mentioning it to me at the time. I told her I didn't love her anymore, that whatever she believed about herself, her actions over half a year had already answered the question of whether she loved me. I told her I wanted her out of my life, that I had zero interest in reconciling after what she'd done with Roger, and that from here forward any conversation between us would be strictly about our kids, who she'd damaged plenty on her own without my help. I told her I intended to protect Maddie and Cole from as much of the fallout as I could, but I had no intention of protecting her from a single consequence of what she'd chosen. She asked angrily why I'd sent Paige Kessling the letter. I told her that what she and Roger had done wasn't just unfair to me, it was unfair to our kids, and that Roger's wife deserved to know the truth about the man she was married to, the same as I deserved to know about mine. Erin said she didn't want a divorce, that she wanted to fight for us. I told her there was nothing left to fight for, and that I'd rather be alone the rest of my life than stay married to her. She called me delusional. Then she pivoted, told me to actually read the petition she'd had served on me, that if I agreed to joint custody, I could keep the house and split everything down the middle. When I didn't jump at that, she threatened to release the footage of her own affair herself, out of spite, if I didn't come around to her terms. I told her I doubted she had it in her. She insisted she did, and that she'd do it purely to hurt me. She begged me to just sign her papers. I told her that if anyone in this conversation was going to be signing anything, it was going to be her. I hung up on her mid-sentence. She signed the papers not long after. The divorce was final in a little under 6 months. Erin still lives in the house on Larkspur Court with Maddie and Cole. I'm in a condo about 10 minutes away, close enough that we kept the kids in the same school district on purpose. It hasn't been painless for either of them, no matter how much we both try to soften it. Maddie told me once that her mother admitted in her own words, to messing up badly enough that our marriage couldn't survive it. We've both made a point of telling the kids, separately and together, that neither of us is going anywhere as parents, whatever else fell apart. I don't know exactly what Erin told her own parents and her sister about why we split, but they still talk to me like people who don't think I'm the villain of the story. So I doubt she painted it as entirely my doing. My mother's take, for what it's worth, is that neither of us is fully past it yet, and she's probably right. Before I gave the recorder back to Pete, I pulled one last recording off it. Erin, calling Roger the afternoon everything came apart, thanking him for their time together that day, telling him she thought I might be getting suspicious and maybe they should cool it for a while. It's strange to hear now, a woman planning to keep something going that had already ended hours earlier without her knowing it yet. On that same tape later, there's the sound of her pulling into the driveway and seeing the signs for the first time. A long silence, then her voice breaking apart completely as she called Roger back to tell him I knew everything. It's been a little over a year since all of it. I'm slowly getting my footing back. I haven't dated and probably won't for a while yet. The idea of opening myself up to a repeat of any of this doesn't appeal to me in the slightest. Maddie mentioned once that her mom went on a single date that ended with her crying at the kitchen table. And as far as I know, she hasn't tried again since. Erin's working the front desk at a retirement community now and has put her real estate license on the shelf, at least for the time being. I have no idea if she's still in touch with Roger, and I've made my peace with not caring one way or the other. Roger and Paige divorced not long after everything came out, and word around town is he's had a hard time finding steady work since. Turns out builders and brokers in the same metro area talk to each other, and a reputation for chasing married women doesn't do much for referrals. I never released any of the footage publicly, though I did keep every second of the audio, even after I agreed to blur Erin's face on anything I still hold on to. I heard recently that Paige is seeing a police officer now, and that it's serious. Good for her. She didn't deserve any of what Roger brought into her life either. As for Prairie Crest Realty, their parent brokerage offered me a quiet settlement to keep the whole thing out of any further headlines, and I took it, mostly because I was tired of thinking about any of them. That chapter's closed as far as I'm concerned. These days my attention is on Maddie and Cole, and getting them through this in one piece. Maybe somewhere down the line, I'll worry about my own future again. For now, theirs is enough.